Welcome back with another YouTube with Lubelski, and we are continuing on in the number system to work on absolute value. So that's a new vocab term that we're going to be talking about. A number line that extends from -10 to 10 is sketched out on the school parking lot. Christine is standing on -5, and Andre is standing on 5. How far away from each other are they? Who is further from 0? So when we look at this, we're looking at the distance that they are from 0. So 0 is that reference points that we've been using. And so if I count the units that they are, we've got Christine, so let's count back 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 units from 0. But to get to Andre, we have to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 more. So they are a total of 10 units away from each other. So the first answer that we have to answer is 10 units away from each other. And that's a great example of what we're actually talking about, is we're talking about distance, and distance isn't negative. And so 10 units away from each other means that if they were to take those 10 steps from one person to the other, they would end up meeting. And so the second question then asks, who is further from 0? Well, we did that. We counted that. Christine is 5 units, and then we had to go from 0 to Andre, who is also 5 units. So 5 units this way and 5 units that way. So they are actually the same distance from 0. And again, we're not talking about positives and negatives in this case. We're talking about how far away from 0 is the number. And so it's just a set number of units that's a positive value. So same distance from 0. So that brings us to absolute value. The absolute value of a number is the distance away from 0 on the number line. It is always positive. So underline that, always positive, because it refers to a distance. And we don't have a negative distance. We can have directions. So I'm going 5 units east or 5 units west, but I don't say I'm going -5 units. So this is where you really have to pay attention, because this is huge. This is not the number 1. This is also not a number 1. These are absolute value signs. So let me zoom out a little bit so I can use my pencil better. Absolute value symbol. So these two straight up and down lines are to denote absolute value, and we read this as it's read as the absolute value of -5. So that's how we read it. And a lot of times kids can get it confused with the number 1 or think it might be a letter L or a capital I, but it is those two lines. When there's 1 on each side of the number, that means the absolute value. Now, to find the absolute value of a number, it's just that number. So the absolute value of -5, it's just the number 5, because again, distance is always positive. So how many units away from 0 is -5? It's 5 units, the negative telling me that it's to the left on the number line. Same thing goes for the absolute value of +5. It is also 5 units, but because there is no sign, then I know that it's 5 units to the right because it's a positive number. So use the number line below to plot points A through E. Now remember, this is not asking me to plot the point of -8. It's asking me to plot the point of plot the absolute value of -8. And the absolute value of -8 is actually +8. So I'm going to plot A at +8, because it's not asking me to put it at -8, it's asking me to put it at the absolute value. So how far is -8 from 0? +8 units. Same thing for the next one. B, -1 is 1 unit away from 0, so I'm going to put B at +1, because the absolute value will always be positive. The distance from 0 for 3 is 3 units, so C goes at 3. And then -4.5 is 4.5 units away from 0. So because we don't have a half unit, we have to kind of make our own little halfway mark between 4 and 5, and that's where our D would be. And then the last one, how many units is 6 away from 0, it's 6. So there's where E. So the absolute value is talking about the distance from 0. That's a vocabulary word that you want to remember. Okay, so now, how do we use absolute value to compare the values in these questions? We're going to write the integer to represent the situations, and we're going to write integers for 5 and 6. But for question number 1, this question is asking, is the distance from 0 of negative 4.9 greater than, less than, or equal to the distance of negative 5 from 0. So negative 4.9 is 4.9 units from 0. Negative 5 is 5 units. So the distance is actually greater. Even though negative 5 is a smaller number on the number line, the distance from 0 is actually greater when we compare it to negative 4.9. For this one, we've got the absolute value, so the distance from 0 for 10 is just 10. And the distance to 0 from negative 10 is also 10. So this is a situation where we have equivalent absolute values, the distance. This is just like Christine and Andre up at the top. They had the same absolute value as one another, even though they were standing on opposite sides of the 0, they had the same absolute value because they were both 5 units away. And this one, they're both 10 units away, so they're equivalent. Negative 36, the absolute value is positive 36 because distance is positive, and the absolute value of negative 19 is positive 19. So this, even though negative 36 is technically a smaller number, it's got a greater distance from 0, and that's what we're comparing, is how far from 0 it is. This one can get a little challenging, but if we write it correctly, we're good to go. The distance from 0 for negative 9 2/3 is positive 9 2/3. And the distance from 9 is just 9. So my greater absolute value is 9 2/3. And remember, this is not comparing negative 9 2/3 and 9. In those situations, a negative will always be smaller. The positive always outweighs the negative. But when we're strictly talking about how far from 0 it is, 9 2/3 units away from 0 is a larger distance than 9. All right, a football team loses 20 yards on a quarterback sack. Write an absolute value to represent the change in yards. So when we're talking about writing an absolute value, we want the absolute value of the change in yards. And in this case, the change in yards was negative 20 because the team loses 20 yards. So that's where my negative 20 comes from. And then it says to write an absolute value to represent it. So that's why I had to put my 2 lines on the sides to represent the absolute value. For number 6, a submarine submerges and travels 120 feet below sea level. So 120 feet below sea level is important because that gives us context. It says write an absolute value to represent the change in depth. So again, our absolute value is the 2 bars on the side. And then in this case, again, below sea level gives us our negative, and then 120 feet is our number. So when we talk about these situations, we can say that the change in depth of the water was 120 feet. We went down 120 feet, so the change was 120 feet below the surface. And so that can also be referred to as a distance. So let's go on. So the next thing is opposites. We've talked about this briefly in classes before, but the opposite of a number is the same distance away from 0, but always on the opposite of the 0 of the number line. So on the other side of the number line, it can be either positive or negative. And remember, opposites are on opposite sides of 0 being that reference point. So it says on the other side, it means it's talking on the other side of the 0. So use your understanding of opposites and absolute value to complete the table below. So we're going to complete this. Identified the number its absolute value and its opposite. So in this number, we're about halfway between 0 and -2, so that puts us at -1. The distance from 0, though, is only 1 unit because distance is always positive. The opposite is also considered 1. And then let's go ahead and let's plot its opposite. So here's the opposite. So put a star on that opposite. And put a little star over the word opposite so we know that we're starring those opposites. The next one, if I look at this, -10, it's a little bit closer to -5, so that's probably about -9. So our number is -9. Our absolute value is 9 units from 0, and our opposite would be +9, and they don't actually give us room on our number line to plot the opposite, which bums me out. All right, the next one, between -1 and -2. So remember, when we're trying to estimate a number, we think of it the same way we do positives and positives. 1 and 2 have 1.5 between it. So -1 and -2 have -1.5 between it. The distance from 0, our absolute value is 1.5, and our opposite would be a +1.5. Okay, our last one. So we've got 6 here and 8 there. That means split that, and 7 would be right here. So this is where we have to understand that the intervals change how we view these number lines. So 7 is right in the middle, and then right in the middle of 7 and 8 would have to be 7.5. So 7.5, and that means it's got a distance of 7.5 units from 0, which is our absolute value. And then the opposite is 7.5, but in the negative direction. So we have to remember to put the negative sign on that for the opposite. Several clues are given to describe various points on the number line below. Determine which number the clue is describing and mark the point on the number line. So point A is 10 away from 0, and its opposite is -10. So if the number's opposite is -10, that means that the number has to be +10. And so if we're looking at this, 10 would be right in the middle of 5 and 15. So here's letter A. The number is 10. B. The opposite of point B is positive. So if the opposite is positive, that means the number has to be negative. It says its absolute value is 15. So even though the distance is 15, that means that it could be -15 or +15, but because the opposite of point B is positive, that means that the original point must be a negative number. So -15. Point C is 20 away from 0, and its opposite is -20. So if its opposite is -20, then it must be +20 is our letter C. Last one, D. The opposite of point D is negative. So if the opposite is negative, it means the number has to be positive. And its absolute value, so its distance from 0 is 5. So it's got to be a +5 because its opposite is -5. Last 2 questions before we move on to the practice. Use your understanding of comparing integers to answer questions 9 and 10. Nikki places 4 different numbers on a number line. What point best represents -2/3? So remember, -2/3 would be on the negative side. So -2/3 would be here. But with the absolute value symbols, we have to plot the positive. We have to plot the distance. So the distance from 0 is 2/3. So D would be the correct answer because D is positive 2/3. Number 10, the magic number is -45. Mark each statement below as true or false. The opposite of the magic number is 45. I think that's true because the opposite of -45 is +45. -45 represents the absolute value of the magic number. That is false because remember, can't be negative distance. So negative 45 doesn't represent the absolute value because distance is positive. Last one, the magic number is 45 units away from 0. That is true. Negative 45 is 45 units away from 0. Notice how I did not say negative 45 units away because distance is positive. So summarizing today's lesson, the absolute value of any number is always positive because it is the distance from 0. Okay, so if you're still feeling like you're not the most confident with this, you can go ahead and follow along with me as we do the practice page. And so in questions 1 through 3, we're going to determine the absolute value of the number. In the questions 4 through 6, we're going to compare values using greater than, less than, or equal to symbols. So for this first question, remember that these are referring to the absolute value of negative 9.8, which means the distance from 0. Now remember when we talked about the distance from 0 is not going to be a negative number. It's just going to be how far away is negative 9.8 from 0. It's 9 8/10 units away from 0. So it's a positive answer. The next one, same thing, the absolute value symbols right here, the 2 lines means the distance from 0. And so it's just 11 2/3 units. Our fraction in this case is a negative number, but remember distance cannot be negative. So the absolute value of negative 2 6/7 is positive 2 6/7 because again, distance cannot be negative. It's the distance from 0. Okay, so comparing these, the first thing we want to do is take the absolute value first and then compare them. So the absolute value of 95 hundredths is 95 hundredths. And the absolute value of negative 1.5 is just 1.5 units away from 0. So when I compare these, the 0 and the 1 are the first digits that I compare. So 0 compared to 1, 1 is greater. So that means that this absolute value is greater than the other. Same thing with this one. We want to make sure that we find the absolute value or the distance from 0 for 10 1/10, negative 10 1/10, and that's going to be positive 10 1/10. For the next one, 10 3/20, the absolute value is 10 3/20 units away from 0. Now with decimals and fractions, we have to get them into similar terms. And so for this, I'm actually going to convert this into a fraction of 10 1/10. But I still need my denominators to match. So I'm going to multiply this 10 by 2. And what I do to the bottom of a fraction, I have to do to the top. So my new number is 10 2/20. So what is more, 10 2/20 or 10 3/20? And the 3/20 would be bigger than the 2/20. So our greater than goes to our 10 3/20. Our next one, the distance from 0 for negative 3 1/4 is just going to be positive 3 1/4 because distance is always positive. Negative 4 is 4 units to the left of 0. And so comparing the mixed number to the whole number, 3 compared to 4, 4 is the larger of the two numbers. Okay, so we have a couple of word problems. So Noah is asked to plot the absolute value, negative 9, on the number line below. Where should Noah plot the number? So the absolute value of negative 9 is actually equal to positive 9 because distance is always positive. I've said that so many times at this point, but the 9 units away from 0 means that if I'm plotting the distance from negative 9, I'm plotting positive 9 on the number line. Which of the following is not true about the number given below, negative 6.7? The number is negative. That is true. The opposite of the number is negative. That is not true. So we're looking for what is not true. The opposite of a negative will always be positive, and the opposite of a positive will always be negative. Let's check the other ones just to be sure, though. The absolute value of the number is positive. That is true. Absolute value will always be positive, but remember, we're looking for the false statement. The number is 6.7 units away from 0. Remember that the absolute value is the distance away from 0, and distance is always positive. So instead of negative 6.7, the distance is a positive 6.7, so also true. So B is that one that is not a true statement. Okay, represent the real world situations with an integer. So this is where we're going to identify the positive or the negative word that gives a sign to my number. So the temperature drops to 15 degrees below 0. Write an absolute value to represent the change in temperature. So if I'm looking at this, drops to 15 degrees below 0, write an absolute value. So an absolute value, the absolute value of negative 15. So the absolute value for the change. The change was negative 15, but we want to take the absolute value. So write an absolute value. Was why we had to add those absolute value signs. Michael has $0 in his account, but makes a purchase and overdrafts his account by $75. So overdrafting your account, that's a negative thing. You spent more money than you have. Write an absolute value to represent the change in Michael's account. So the change was negative $75, but we want to do the absolute value for the change. An elevator rises to the 9th floor. Rises means positive, to go up to the 9th floor. Write an absolute value to represent the change in the floor levels. So there was a change of 9 levels, the absolute value from 0, 9 levels. The parking garage is located 4 floors underneath ground level. So 4 floors, the word underneath tells me negative. Write an absolute value to represent the distance in floors from the ground. So the negative 4, because it's 4 floors underneath ground level, and then we're going to take the absolute value of that. And there you have it.
Did you do it? Did you finish it? I'm so excited. You did such a good job. My dog thinks I'm weird. She judging me. She's so judgy. Look how judgy she is.